Welcome to the Tanz im August podcast. This podcast series is part of the Tanz im August Festival, presented by HAU Hebbel am Ufer. This year it takes place from 13th to 30th of August in Berlin. Several artists from this year's program have been invited to join a conversation series. In each episode, they share insights into their lives and creative work. The artists talk about their past and current projects and offering in-depth perspectives on the works they are presenting at Tanz im August. In this episode, Ricardo Carmona, artistic director of the festival, talks with Ligia Lewis. She will present her new work Something Folk with the company Cullberg on 28th, 29th and 30th of August at HAU.
Hello, Ligia. Nice to have you with us for this episode of the podcast. I would like to ask you to introduce yourself first.
It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Ligia Lewis. I work as a choreographer and director, and I am in the process of developing a new work called Something Folk for Tanz im August.
Before we dive into the conversation about Something Folk, can you share something that is inspiring for you in the last few days? Connected or not connected to dance? Something that you just found it very inspiring.
Well, I'm a new mother, and so every day is quite inspiring because you see a child developing very quickly before your eyes, and you're engaging in all different forms of play that are unknown to yourself, and you become unknown to yourself in some ways in the process, and that's really beautiful and inspiring.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks for sharing that. So looking across your body of work, how do you feel your artistic language has evolved in the last years? Because you've been doing a lot of work also in theater and outside of theater spaces. And what does that, how do you see this, and what's continue to be a challenge for you?
That's a good question. I feel I've honed a kind of physical language that is very theatrical and tends to be recurring within works. And that's been a way of providing myself a way of engaging with kind of theatrical representation or representation in and of itself in a way that acknowledges the fact that it is representation, and then how to work with and against it to pose certain questions about the body. And I think recently works, basically moving image, so works for camera, allowed me to go deeper into, because the process of editing is very useful for a choreographer. So I work on kind of every aspect of all my productions, and also really decide what you want in a frame and how you want it to appear is really important. And so I feel like that has helped me kind of sharpen some tools when I've returned back to the theater.
Yeah, makes sense, makes super sense. So this is your first collaboration with the company Cullberg, and also it's the first collaboration that you do with the Fixed Ensemble company. What drew you to make that decision, and also why you decided to work with Cullberg?
Yeah, good question. This is the first collaboration with Cullberg. And yeah, I've never worked with a repertory company. And I never, first of all, thought I'd ever be invited to work with a repertory company, because within the scene of dance and choreography, I see myself as someone that's more of an experimentalist. And so because I'm experimenting with forms, usually that's not usually invited, I generally think. But I think that the new director somehow had interest, I guess, and came to see a couple of shows. And through conversations that spanned over the course of, I think, 6 months, I was over time convinced that this is something that could be interesting for me. It's interesting because for me, it has almost less pressure, even though it, in some ways, because there are many things that are kind of figured out for you in a way, in terms of production and in terms, they facilitate a lot of things. And in some ways it gives the artists that they've invited a lot of space and time to kind of dream, because you're working outside of there are many other logistical constraints that you're confronted with when you're leading your own production. So this has been very interesting. Also, it's of course that you're working with dancers that you didn't necessarily choose, and that brings certain challenges, but other attributes as well. So I'm so far enjoying the process. It is hard, I think, for everyone, but I'm enjoying it.
No, that's great. I mean, this is so fun, super interesting in this combination. And I see this a lot happening in the last years, that there's these big companies with fixed ensembles and repertoire companies, they are inviting a younger generation to also to make works with them, and also more experimental, as you say. And this is something very important for me. And I also found it relevant to showcase this during the festival. Yeah. So I think it's going to be a nice combination between you and the team of Cullberg. So let's go to the work, right? So the title is Something Folk. So there's two words. It's not something, it's something. And what is behind of this title, or why did you choose this also?
It came out of a kind of longer thread of interest for me to kind of interrogate the way in which we come together. So how do I challenge the way in which collectivity gets performed in the present? And having come from the Caribbean, living in the United States, and then moving to Europe, and having bounced between these multiple contexts, I recognize that collectivity is a term that is used, but often without the consideration of radical difference. Like, how do we collectivize indifference? And so this idea of folk emerges for me as a kind of political question of folk, both how folks come together in consideration of some folks mattering more than other folks, and also how I can play with this idea of folk as not being something from a distant past, but rather something that's always emerging in the present. We are always constructing who we are, what we are, how we move in the world constantly. So folklore is a way, they're stories that are carried in the body. So I wanted to provoke this way of thinking about these stories as being emergent. They're always developing, they're always hybridized. And rather than going to some sort of working through this idea of like what I've described, or working against, let's say, this idea of an ethnographic gaze, to go elsewhere, to bring a folk from elsewhere, it's rather to invite all the performers to see the folk within. And to see that as a script that's constantly unfolding and that holds radical forms of difference, I think, or can, and how I can bring this together in a form that is playful, that is provocative, that points to some of the problems of coming together, while also hopefully pointing to possibilities of being radically together, potentially.
Yeah. Super interesting. I think also like what you were speaking about, this notion of folk, it's also a term that is very loaded historically and also culturally. And also most of the times it's connected to nationality and nationalistic meanings. So, and there's also, I feel also there's a paradox in the notion, because as you're describing, folk can also be very communal in the way to get together. But once you get together, you also exclude people. So how do you deal also with these contradictions and all these layers inside of the piece?
The thing is that I think that I have to confront in some ways the dangers of folk. Once you invoke it, you have to deal with its mess. And so I didn't want to fall into the trappings of building something very naive and naively utopic, let's say. I was like, no, we have to actually dig into the problems of the present that are all historically bound, right? Or everything is kind of tethered to this very tricky colonial past. So how to think folk as something that's emergent, right? So I keep saying that it's something that keeps unfolding. So so I'm trying to be as fantastical as possible. So I want to play with the bodies in these very figurative ways and these very imaginative ways to depart from something that's maybe too familiar to anyone. So it's a kind of, so this process of alienation happens for each performer. So we talk a lot in the process also when we're working about how do we get into something that's specific to our own ancestral present, to borrow a term from Elizabeth Povinelli, that's in our own heritage, right? And how do we kind of unlock that? But how do we share it? So how does it become a shared material across the group? And it's very interesting because when we work, I'm always kind of talking about to the performers about listening more than creating. And there's a way in which you can approach some of these materials where it becomes a generous form of sharing rather than a kind of possessing or owning and there's a way in which we have to work in this very prismatic way that the materials are constantly unfolding. So we're constantly being confronted with how much we actually hold in our bodies and how much of that is already actually shared. And that breaks with the kind of Western imaginary of what folk is. So Western imaginary thinks immediately goes to the Orient or to the global South to be like those others that are doing that native thing or that primitive thing, right? So we talk a lot about how to break with this kind of logic. And it's like, no, the other is always within. So we don't have to travel elsewhere to find folk. Actually, it's always happening in the studio, is already a kind of folklore because we do our ritual every day. So I lead the warm-ups. I was like, the folk already begins now. So this is a kind of temporary holding for a folk that's emerging through this process. And it carries with it a kind of, hopefully, the materials that's carried in everybody's body, but also a kind of additional imaginary that I'm pushing into the space. So I'm locating our folk in an elsewhere time. So I needed something that at least is common. So it's set in another time. So it could be either a distant past or a potential future. It's something elsewhere. So I'm in part inspired by like sci-fi stuff, but and also really beautiful Soviet film that I saw. And I mean, there are a number of things that have influenced the way in which I want to figure this work, but it's hybrid. It's like a very hybrid form. It's like a dance theater piece that will, there's a lot of play in it. Let's say that. And also shows some of the dangers of what happens when folk do get together, particularly, and how that can create a kind of position of power. And because initially I had so the first title was going to be Not Yet a Title. And I wanted to work because I was like, the moment that you title, and this is something that I'm borrowing from Adanya Shibli, who's an amazing Palestinian author. And she just, and I love the way that she describes this and about how giving something a title gives it power. And so I was like, if I want to engage this idea of folk, what if it doesn't have a name yet, right? It's something that then stays open, that doesn't take away something from other, right? Or it doesn't close itself off to others, right? That it's something that's constantly always in process of being made. And then I found this other title, which I think is more appropriate, The Something. And that thing stays kind of hopefully open-ended, that it's something that doesn't close. And I think I want to also say, which I think is very important as someone that is engaged critically with questions around Blackness and diaspora and racial politics, et cetera, that this work, it is really trying to find a way out of some of the traps in the present, because right now there is a nativist return. There has been a way in which the far right has appropriated the language of indigenous struggle and has now closed and has staked claims for a kind of pure national identity. And this work wants to completely break with this really violent forms of closure that happen in in people's minds, and in the political imaginary is very at the moment, particularly in Europe and in the Western world, is just really horrific. It's just like very, very unimaginative. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, totally. There's really like almost like a crisis of imagination of what other worlds could be possible. Totally. Yeah. I mean, you did speak a lot about power relationships now, and also your work in the past also connects to that topic. So I was wondering also how you bring this together also to the body of the dancers, and also what's the role of this notion of belonging, right? Because this has been also like a topic that you've been speaking the last minutes also about that.
From the very early parts of the creation process, I had to be very clear with where I'm located and how I locate myself, how I position myself, both politically and artistically, and that my work is always political. Even as imaginative and playful as it might appear, the root is always out of a very intense political question or a provocation of, if anything, my work hopefully operates mostly as a kind of social critique. There have been many questions that have emerged in the process. And I said that, I was like, okay, for us to at least agree to this work and to being together in this process, we have to agree on a few facts, and I had to name them quite clearly about the role that the Western world, whiteness in the last 500 years, like the weight of modernity and its imprint on everything, on every piece of land, is so grand that it makes it nearly impossible to think our way out of these logics. And because of that, we work very meticulously in the studio. But we have to agree, at least, that this history has touched all of our bodies very differently, and we have to respect that. And I always utter what are we doing? We're working on folk. Why? Because some folk matter more than other folk. How are we doing it? And I keep uttering that to remind us. Okay, it's very silly. It's very, it's very absurd, and cruel things happen in the village for sure. And power's constantly shifting, as it does throughout modernity. And I mean, humans are, that's the thing. Agency is something that is both a plus, but also a negative. It's something that can quickly get abused. And this is not unique to a certain people. This is just the conditions of being human. But some humans are considered more than, and some are considered less than, right? So there's all these kinds of provocations on what it is to be human as well, and what it means to be folk. And so my work is often also painted with a lot of questions I have for myself, and then questions that I share with the performers. And it's just constantly getting at a kind of specificity of language, so physical language, through repetition, through like a really, like we're working really hard in the studio. And because I was like, we need materials first. We need to produce the tension within the studio, within the materials, before good questions can emerge. So despite feeling like this proposal is like kind of almost impossible, which I love, and is full of like lots of representational traps, it's what really is exciting for me. Because I can't explain it, but it's...
Yeah, because I think also like when you carry, or not you personally, but like when anyone carries a question with them, it obliges us to move. I think also for me, it's also questions that push me towards something, that activate me, so to speak, yeah. And also you spoke a while ago about this idea of new utopia vision, also with all these questions and with all these problematics. And can you talk a bit more about this and how it looks and how it feels for you inside of the piece?
So for me, utopia is something that can't be imaged. It's something that has to emerge out of a process. as a potential. It can only be a potential, but I think it's not something that can be clearly figured. And so I did go in initially quite naively trying to arrive at this dream of a kind of folk that is engaged through radical difference and that can articulate something beyond what we know of the human, right? But there are just so many representational traps. And I realized that, okay, I have to first deal with the mess of being human before I can get beyond it. This emerged quite quickly in the studio for me. I was like, oh, okay, wow, all right. Actually, we need to first deal with the problem of the human to get beyond it, right? And so what I'm hoping is that there is something already that I must say is already utopian that happens just through the process of creation, because these are always like these precious moments of sociality. We talk so much about sociality. It's so crazy. Like, how do you make that so like vibrant within the space that is a material? It's more interesting than someone's individual movement, which I'm actually not interested in at all, which is also a mindfuck for this repertory company. Many of them are still very lost, but they will find their way. But I was like, I could give a fuck less about your individual movement. It means absolutely nothing to me. But through this sociality that's getting rehearsed, like in a process, and of course, there's tensions there, lots of questions. We laugh, we get frustrated. There's something utopian in that because we come together already in difference. You know what I mean? Like, so that is there already, right? So the hints of that will emerge, but I want to be very cautious in just trying to represent it. For me, it's something that's always in process, right? And it's not something to take for granted, and it doesn't look like one particular thing. And it's also something that is fleeting all the time. And so for me, like everything and like all my work, I just arrived again at, utopia and kind of dystopia in conversation with one another always.
Yeah, taking a bit on that you just said now, can you tell us a bit what reference in terms of music reference, literature reference? You also spoke about the film that you saw. So some of the materials that inspired you to make the work or are still inspiring, because we are recording this episode on the end of April and the premiere is going to be in the end of August. So you're still in process also. Yeah.
Still very much in process, but there were some things that initiated this production, which was the work of there's Elizabeth Povinelli describes this idea of the ancestral present in a book that I have, and I'm Gaia, the Earth. It's really incredible, but and it's more of this is by way of her working with an indigenous community in Australia, and she problematized the kind of late liberal capitalism and the kind of colonial violence and the violence of the settler and what that does, and imaging catastrophe, for example, in the present when everyone talks about climate crisis, for example, she's like, yeah, that's not a present problem. That's something that, for example, indigenous communities have known since the onslaught. This is from 15th century, the crisis began then, actually, the climate crisis, right? It's the instigation of this kind of settler colonial violence that has refigured the entire globe and has set it that has detached all of this incredible knowledge, basically, all of these epistemologies, and flattened them into a kind of Eurocentric way of, or approach, or whatever, to world, land, people, relation. It goes on and on. So, so these really beautiful provocations of and then I would say Sylvia Wynter is a Jamaican scholar who has written beautifully about how she describes it as man one and man two, man one being the European that the European figure is the figure that is almost overly represented throughout modernity. But there are other kinds of humans, and that those have just not been figured in the same way. And Zakiya Amon-Jackson is another amazing scholar that wrote a book, Becoming Human, that is for me, it was just one of the most transformative things I ever read. I couldn't believe it. And she discusses, it was something specific to Blackness, is this condition of being considered more than and less than human, but never just human, never just regular. So either you're like exceptional or you're like completely, like, it's just, yeah, it's anyway. But she does this incredible deep dive, and she travels across like from literature to science to painting, and reminds the reader that exactly the human, although it's been overly determined by Western humanism, is still something, it's discursive, it's more than biocentric. It's something that, is being languaged all the time, and that it's a script that we can rewrite also. And so that's why when I play with this provocation of folk, it's like we are still folk, right? Not the folk maybe that Germany was interested in the turn of the 20th century, but like the folk of that's something that we can constantly interrogate, and that we can be much more imaginative. Octavia Butler, Bloodchild, the way, and I mean, Hard to Be a God, is the film that I'm referring to also.
Maybe let's stay a bit with the film, because I also find it very interesting also that you take this film as a visual inspiration, right? Like, I would like maybe to ask you a bit more about the film and how you connect with it. So the film is Hard to Be a God from Alexei German.
So this is a film, actually my partner shared it with me, and I fell in love with it. I was like, oh my God. This is everything from the framing to the physical language, the way, the details of the film, how immersive it is while simultaneously being strangely alienating. And I felt like, I was like, oh, that's what it feels like to be Black in the Western world. Literally, I watched this. And this is a film that's critiquing Stalinist era Russia. I thought that was very interesting, that I could draw this weird, unexpected maybe comparison to Blackness. But I was like, oh, right, that's what you feel in the modern world. Like this, the weight of state violence, and like the inability to find your way out of what feels like cruelty, just like no rhyme, no reason, just cruel, right? And I found it just a very it's actually based on the Strugatsky like sci-fi novels, but which I also have. Yeah, I thought, okay, this is a very interesting way to set it in a medieval time. Like I found it very productive to figure the film in another time that makes it an elsewhere, that in a way is a kind of way to work allegorically, so to provoke another way of seeing the present. And for me, I just found that very productive, because it's very difficult to represent the present moment. I also generally never liked the use of the term contemporary in relationship to my work. I've always just actually, because I was like, I've been much more seduced. I'm just much more busy with a past that's never passed. So I feel like I'm always kind of having to look back still, or that past, not even have to look at it. It's just being carried with me. And so I like this provocation of the use of time. I love the rhythm of the film. Also, the use of what I'm trying to now translate into the studio is the use of strange time and real time. And these are two modes that break with dramatic time quite drastically, and the way in which the theater is usually approached. So I'm interested in, for example, in this idea of a choreographic landscape, in part inspired by the way in which he used, I think, wide frames and in close-ups and stuff, like how he fills the frame. It's very painterly. I mean, this is not totally new, because I've been kind of working on this figuration, and I've made, Still Not Still is also a choreographic landscape. So it's something that I will continue, but in a way, this film made me even that much more excited about continuing and working on this in this way of a choreographic landscape, to try to make something that's very strange yet very alive and has this feeling of unfolding in real time.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing all this. It's also really amazing how then art pieces connect with each other, even decades apart, and also they speak also in different perspectives about the same thing, right? Yeah. I mean, also looking back to your work in the last years, sound, language, voice, they also play a very important role. So I was wondering if this is going to be the same case again for something folk.
Yes, voice will appear. Text will appear in different ways, playful ways, either sung, uttered, whispered. I love the texture of voice. Just in general, when I'm figuring bodies, it's really important for me to animate every expressive possibility of that figure. From the sound of the feet walking on the floor, it will also be a mic'd stage. So everything, the weight of the body is heard. It's very material. But so is breath, the sound of a whisper. So is a song. So all of it for me becomes part of this material landscape. So yes, there will be voice, of course. And the sound is going to be all originally composed. So Anton Katz/Ilyich is working on that. And my twin brother will also join in parts. There's some folky stuff we wanted to that he's very engaged with already in his practice. So the sonic landscape is going to be very rich. And there's going to be qualities of things that I like. There's a certain kind of Americana that appears. That is it is within my lived experience. It's the little piece of thing that I can take still from a country that is so flawed and fucked. And so but a kind of early kind of blues that will get mashed up with other kind of sonic landscapes, which Anton will be responsible for. But we have a kind of interesting sonic landscape. But yeah, we're still working on it. There are many things that I thought I was going to do, and then it's still it'll be stranger than what I originally thought. which ends up happening as a result of being in the studio a lot. But I love being in the studio a lot because an idea idea appears, but then you get behind the idea and then you keep going, and then you're like, oh, it pushes you somewhere. Yeah.
I mean, also we know that the piece is done also by different elements, and you just mentioned also the names of the people that are working with you on the sound, the music. Maybe you can also speak about the persons that are working with you on the set design, costumes, and also light design.
So I'm working with Joseph Wegman, who I've collaborated with for many years on light design, which is very exciting. And also Sasha Kovacic, who's working on costumes. I've worked with him a bunch as well. And so I'm very happy about that. And then this is my first collaboration with Pia Gill, who's a Swedish-based costume designer / set designer, and we worked together both on the set, on the scenography. The scenographic material kind of appeared later for me, but is now the first thing that we've finished, and it's it's beautiful. I mean, I'm happy about it because it's a very figurative approach. So I already described that I want it to look a little bit like a moving painting, and the scenography very much provides that feel for it. And it will certainly be a world.
And do you feel there is the difference in terms of creating inside of a company or independently in terms of this process of dialogues between dancers, choreographer, light designer, set designer, music, etc., etc.?
For me, I'm kind of working the way I always work, in a way, because I'm so fixed in the way that I work. It's my rhythm. It's how I want to do things. And I was very happy that Cullberg was just willing to accommodate that. So it's just and I think for the performers, I imagine it's good for them just to enter into a creation of the artist that they invite and just join it. And it's a process for sure. And as I shared, I'm working also with a number of collaborators that I've worked with before. So this is great. So it is like a meeting of my world and Cullberg's world in a way, and seeing what we can do together.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yeah. So maybe just to wrap up a bit our conversation, you have been speaking also about this utopic belonging. So I wanted to ask you, what gives you hope today when you think about this, about community, about togetherness?
Wow, that's a good question. And a hard one. You know, togetherness is a term that I want to both challenge in some ways, because I don't think it is easy to come together. And while at the same time, I think we need to more. But I think we have to be more honest in how we see one another and how we can carry more than our own burdens. And that's the only way that you can come together, is when you can actually carry the burdens of others as well. And there's certainly not enough of that. Because if there was, everyone would be on the streets right now, and they're not. So what makes me hopeful is the kind of moment of despair that we're in. It's so revealing. It's so honest in its cruelty that I think that we're not in a time anymore of having to convince people of it, but rather now we need to get into the space of mobilizing together and because the things are dire. So if anything, I think there's more urgency now, or there should be at least, than ever.
Well, thanks a lot for this conversation and everything that you said about the politics, about power, about the situation where we're living, and also how this is totally connected to your work and also to dance and performing arts field. Yeah, thanks for that. So looking forward to see the piece then happening in front of us in August. And
Me too.